The Israeli-Lebanese conflict, or the South Lebanon conflict, is a series of military clashes involving Israel, Lebanon and Syria, the Palestine Liberation Organization, as well as various militias and militants acting from within Lebanon. The conflict peaked in the 1980s during the Lebanese Civil War and has abated since. The Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, recruited militants in Lebanon from among the Palestinian refugees who had been expelled or fled after the creation of Israel in 1948. After the PLO leadership and its Fatah brigade were expelled from Jordan in 1970-71 for fomenting a revolt, they entered southern Lebanon, resulting in an increase of internal and cross-border violence. Meanwhile, demographic tensions over the Lebanese National Pact led to the Lebanese Civil War, 1975-1990. PLO actions were one of the key factors in the eruption of the Lebanese Civil War, and its bitter battles with Lebanese factions caused foreign intervention. Israel's 1978 invasion of Lebanon pushed the PLO north of the Litani River, but the PLO continued their campaign against Israel. Israel invaded Lebanon again in 1982 in alliance with the major Lebanese Christian militias of the Lebanese Forces and Kateb Party and forcibly expelled the PLO. In 1983, Israel and Lebanon signed the May 17th Agreement, providing a framework for the establishment of normal bilateral relations between the two countries, but relations were disrupted with takeover of Shia and Druze militias in early 1984. Israel withdrew from most of Lebanon in 1985, but kept control of a 19-kilometer, 12-mile security buffer zone, held with the aid of proxy militants in the South Lebanon Army, SLA. In 1985, Hezbollah, a Lebanese Shia radical movement sponsored by Iran, called for armed struggle to end the Israeli occupation of Lebanese territory. When the Lebanese Civil War ended and other warring factions agreed to disarm, Hezbollah and the SLA refused. Combat with Hezbollah weakened Israeli resolve and led to a collapse of the SLA and an Israeli withdrawal in 2000 to their side of the UN-designated border. Citing Israeli control of the Shabaya Farms territory, Hezbollah continued cross-border attacks intermittently over the next 6 years. Hezbollah now sought the release of Lebanese citizens in Israeli prisons and successfully used the tactic of capturing Israeli soldiers as leverage for a prisoner exchange in 2004. The capturing of 2 Israeli soldiers by Hezbollah ignited the 2006 Lebanon War. Its ceasefire called for the disarmament of Hezbollah and the respecting of the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Lebanon by Israel. Hostilities were suspended on 8th September 2006. As of early 2023, the situation remained calm, despite both sides violating the ceasefire agreements. Israel by making near-daily flights over Lebanese territory, and Hezbollah by not disarming. But an increase in violence during the April 2023 Israel-Lebanon shellings, the spillover of the 2023 Israel-Hamas war, and the 2023 Israel-Lebanon border conflict has led to fears of another war, and the beginning of a conflict between militants and Israel. Zones of French and British influence and control imagined by the 1916 Sykes-Picot Agreement. The territories of what would become the states of Israel and Lebanon were once part of the Ottoman Empire, which lasted from 1299 until its defeat in World War I and subsequent dissolution in 1922. As a result of the Sinai and Palestine campaign in 1917, the British occupied Palestine and parts of what would become Syria. French troops took Damascus in 1918. The League of Nations officially gave the French the Mandate of Syria and the British the Mandate of Palestine after the 1920 San Remo Conference, in accordance with the 1916 Sykes-Picot Agreement. The largely Christian enclave of the French Mandate became the French-controlled Lebanese Republic in 1926. Lebanon became independent in 1943, as France was under German occupation, though French troops did not completely withdraw until 1946. The rise of anti-Semitism in Europe, culminating in the Holocaust during World War II, had meant an increase of Jewish immigrants to a minority Jewish, majority Arab mandate. At the prompting of Arab leaders in the region, Lebanon agreed to join the other armies that were being assembled around the perimeter of the British Mandate territory of Palestine for the purpose of invading Palestine. Lebanon committed 1,000 of these soldiers to the cause. The Arab armies waited for the end of the mandate and the withdrawal of British forces, which was set for 15th of May 1948. Israel declared its independence on 14th May 1948. The next day, the British mandate officially expired, and in an official cablegram, the 7-member Arab League, including Lebanon, publicly proclaimed their aim of creating a democratic United State of Palestine in place of the United Nations Partition Plan for Palestine. The League soon entered the conflict on the side of the Palestinian Arabs, thus beginning the international phase of the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, Transjordan, and Iraq declared war on the new state of Israel. They expected an easy and quick victory in what came to be called the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. The Lebanese army joined the other Arab armies in the invasion. It crossed into the northern Galilee. By the end of the conflict, however, it had been repulsed by Israeli forces, which occupied South Lebanon. Israel signed armistice agreements with each of its invading neighbors. The armistice with Lebanon was signed on 23 March 1949. As part of the agreement with Lebanon, Israeli forces withdrew to the international border. By the conclusion of that war, Israel had signed ceasefire agreements with all of the neighboring Arab countries. The territory it now controlled went well beyond what had been allocated to it under the United Nations Partition Plan, incorporating much of what had been promised to the Palestinian Arabs under the plan. However, it was understood by all the state parties at the time that the armistice agreements were not peace treaties with Israel, nor the final resolution of the conflict between them, including the borders. After the war, the United Nations estimated 701,000 Palestinian Arabs, out an estimated 1.8 million dwelling in the Mandate of Palestine, fled, emigrated, or were forced out of Israel and entered neighboring countries. By 1949, there were 110,000 Palestinian Arabs in Lebanon, moved into camps established by and administered by the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees in the Near East. With the exception of 2 camps in the Beirut area, the camps were mostly Muslim. Lebanese Christians feared that the Muslim influx would affect their political dominance and their assumed demographic majority. Accordingly, they imposed restrictions on the status of the Palestinian refugees. The refugees could not work, travel, or engage in political activities. Initially, the refugees were too impoverished to develop a leadership capable of representing their concerns. Less democratic regimes also feared the threat the refugees posed to their own rule, but Lebanon would prove too weak to maintain a crackdown. The Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, recruited militants in Lebanon from among the families of Palestinian refugees who had left Israel in 1948. Despite sharing in the ongoing border tensions over water, Lebanon rejected calls by other Arab governments to participate in the 1967 Six-Day War. Militarily weak in the south, Lebanon could not afford conflict with Israel. Nevertheless, the loss of additional territory radicalized the Palestinians languishing in refugee camps hoping to return home. On 8 May 1970, a PLO faction, called the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, DFLP, crossed into Israel and carried out the Avivim school bus massacre. In 1970, the PLO attempted to overthrow a reigning monarch, King Hussein of Jordan, and following his quashing of the rebellion in what Arab historians call Black September, the PLO leadership and their troops fled from Jordan to Syria and finally Lebanon, where cross-border violence increased. With headquarters now in Beirut, PLO factions recruited new members from the Palestinian refugee camps. South Lebanon was nicknamed Fatahland, due to the predominance there of Yasser Arafat's Fatah organization. With its own army operating freely in Lebanon, the PLO had created a state within a state. By 1975, more than 300,000 Palestinian displaced persons lived in Lebanon. In reaction to the 1972 Munich massacre, Israel carried out Operation Spring of Youth. Members of Israel's elite special forces landed by boat in Lebanon on 9 April 1973, and with the aid of Israeli intelligence agents, infiltrated the PLO headquarters in Beirut and assassinated several members of its leadership. In 1974, the PLO altered its focus to include political elements, necessary for a dialogue with Israel. Those who insisted on a military solution left to form the Rejectionist Front. and Yasser Arafat took over the PLO leadership role. The Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, General Command, which split from the PLO in 1974, carried out the Kiryat Shmona massacre in April of that year. In May 1974, the DFLP crossed again into Israel and carried out the Ma'alot massacre. The Lebanese Civil War, 1975-1990, was a complex conflict in the form of various factions and shifting alliances between and among Lebanese Maronite Catholics, Lebanese Muslims, Palestinian Muslims, Lebanese Druze, and other non-sectarian groups. Governmental power had been allotted among the different religious groups by the National Pact, based partially on the results of the 1932 census. Changes in demographics and increased feelings of deprivation by certain ethnic groups, as well as Israeli-Palestinian clashes in the south of the county, all contributed to the outbreak of the Lebanese Civil War. Israeli support to Lebanese forces. Beginning in May 1976, Israel supplied the Maronite militias, including the Lebanese forces, led by Bashir Gemayel, with arms, tanks, and military advisors. The border between Israel and Lebanon was nicknamed the Good Fence. Fearing loss of commercial access to the port of Beirut, in June 1976, Syria intervened in the civil war to support the Maronite-dominated government, and by October had 40,000 troops stationed within Lebanon. On 11 March 1978, 11 PLO militants made a beach landing 30 kilometers south of Haifa, Israel, where they seized a bus full of people, killing those on board in what is known as the Coastal Road Massacre. By the end of the incident, 9 hijackers and 38 Israeli civilians, including 13 children, were dead. In response, on 14 March 1978, Israel launched Operation Litani, occupying southern Lebanon, except for the city of Tyre, with 25,000 troops. The objective was to push the PLO away from the border and bolster a Lebanese Christian militia allied with Israel, the South Lebanese Army, SLA. However, the PLO concluded from the name of the operation that the invasion would halt at the Litani River and moved their forces north, leaving behind a token force of a few hundred men. As a result, the casualties were almost all civilians. On 19 March 1978, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 425, which called for Israel's immediate withdrawal and the establishment of a United Nations interim force in Lebanon. Before we wrap up, a quick legal note. GeoRumor provides news updates. It does not offer professional advice. Consult with your licensed professional for personalized advice. That's all for today's episode. Don't forget to subscribe to GeoRumor. Share it with your network. We bring you the latest on world affairs. It includes the United States, Israel, North Korea, and everything in between. Stay informed, stay connected. I'm Olivia Smith, signing off. Keep the global conversation alive.